Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Paulson. Senator Lee.
Thanks so much for your testimony. I appreciate having each of you here. Mr. Graham, why don't we start with you? One of the difficulties that we have here involves measuring regulatory costs and doing so in a way that is understandable to members of Congress, that members of Congress can get behind. So by way of analogy, in the budgeting context, we've come up with a baseline. And so even though not every member of Congress will necessarily agree with the baseline methodology that's used, it at least does give us some metric by which we can, according to which we can kind of navigate our discussion. Do you think it's possible, that it would be possible for us to construct sort of a baseline, a definition set that would allow us to estimate the cost of a particular regulation or the aggregate costs of all regulations in a particular year? And what do you think some of the uses of that might be if we could do it?
There is a former colleague of mine at OMB, Dr. John Morale, who has written extensively on the concept of a regulatory budget, which would be analogous to the appropriations process, but it's for costs that are imposed upon businesses and state and local governments that are not showing in the federal budget. And his idea is that you would try to basically expect Congress to exert discipline in this process by setting limitations on maybe an annual or every other year basis on how large these regulatory costs or unfunded mandates could be over time. It's a complex business of trying to define those baselines, but as your point is well taken, the budgetary baselines are pretty complicated to do. So I think in principle it's possible to do. I think the avenue that I would like to see is that you try to do a pilot project of this on maybe a couple agencies. You do that for a couple years and you see how it goes, and then if you're comfortable, then you could try to do that on a government-wide basis. I think to try to just leap and do that on a government-wide basis, like through next year in legislation, I think that's a prescription for the UK's problem. The UK actually tried to do a government-wide regulatory budget, and after passing the legislation and trying to implement it, they just basically gave up. So in a sense, they tried too hard, and they didn't take off a modest amount that they could actually learn from.
You think it might be better, for example, than to start with saying, okay, we're going to try to develop such a model in the context of EPA and FDA, or pick any two regulatory bodies?
Right. Pick a couple of big regulators and have them do that as a regulatory budget and try it as a pilot for a couple of years. Yes.
And you think that would be helpful to the economy to have Congress at least move in the direction of developing some kind of measure for aggregate regulatory compliance cost?
Yes, because one way to think about this is Congress never actually deliberates and votes on the overall impact they're imposing on the business community and state and local governments every year.
Right.
And I would argue that you should have some heat on you to have to actually deliberate on that and vote on that. And the regulatory budget is explicitly designed to induce that. But it's a complicated idea, and it needs to be
deliberately designed to what?
It's deliberately designed to compel the legislature to assume the responsibility for saying this is how much regulatory burden we're willing to impose for the next year or the next 2 years. So it requires that deliberation and those votes.
Are you familiar with the REINS Act? The REINS Act is a bill that's been introduced. It's been passed by the House for the last 2 or 3 years in a row. It's been introduced in the Senate, but we have not had occasion to vote on it. It stands for Regulations in Need of Scrutiny. It says basically that for any new major rule to take effect, major rule as defined by OMB, with an aggregate economic impact of $100 million or more, that it would need to be passed affirmatively into law. It would need to pass the House and the Senate and be signed into law by the President. This is an approach that would put Congress, as I see it, back in charge of actually making the law. In other words, what you described as a problem in which you've got executive branch agencies run by men and women who well educated, very well intentioned, and very hardworking, knowledgeable within their subject field matter areas, and very skilled, are not elected by the people and are therefore not accountable to the people as members of Congress are. But if you had those major rules act as sort of proposals, and proposals that could not take effect, could not bind the general public unless or until they were enacted into law by Congress, then you would have Congress do the legislating. Do you think this would help address some of the problem you've described?
Yeah, what I would do is couple that idea with Dr. Greenstone's Congressional Budget Office Regulatory Analysis Branch, because I think Congress would need fairly in-depth assessment of each of these rules from an independent body. So my suggestion would be start with Dr. Greenstone's idea, get the CBO Regulatory Analysis Branch up and running and have it issue reports on legislation and regulation, and then take the step. I think jumping right to the RAINS Act and then have Congress vote on all these rules, I think that's too, I think it's not realistic, because you don't have the evidence and analytic base to be deliberating on this level of specificity that we have in each of these regulations that we've talked about in the testimony. I think we're a ways from that.
Yeah, although arguably that's part of the problem, though, isn't it?
It is part of the problem, but we need to build the culture and the capability to get Congress involved in a meaningful way on a regulation by regulation basis. That's a big change from where we are now.
Yeah, no,
and we're not anywhere close to having the evidence and analytical infrastructure on the Congress to do that.
okay, I think Mr. Greenstone wanted
Yeah, if I could just, I'm just going to underscore what Dr. Graham was saying. I think the first order problem in regulatory policy is the almost near complete opacity on what the impacts, both on the cost side and also on the benefit side. And the fact that we don't have like a reliable set of information about that, it means people can say anything, and anything could be true or not true, and there's no basis to judge what's false and what's true. And so I think any regulatory reform that is going to be successful is going to have to seed that environment with information that would allow all of you to make judgments. I mean, right now I don't think, candidly, there's the information for all of you to make judgments on a lot of the regulation.
Right, right. Although, and I understand the point you're both making. I would add to that, though, that in the meantime, we're subjecting the American economy to an estimated $2 trillion, nearly $2 trillion in annual regulatory compliance costs. And so by doing nothing, we continue through our own past delegation of authority, recklessly broad delegation of authority, I might add. We're subjecting the American people to a lot of things a lot of laws that are basically legislated without any elected official being involved in it.
So the European Parliament feels the same way. They feel that in Brussels, the European Commission is imposing an enormous burden throughout the European economy. And where did they start, the European Parliament? They started by creating the analytic capacity and an impact assessment unit to actually independently analyze what the European Commission was giving them. Okay? And if we don't have that step, the rest is not going to be smooth.
I want to remain in good standing with our beloved chairman. Thank you very much.
You are. Thank you, Senator. I think your point